The world gasped when Pope Leo XIV refused to shake Jonathan Roumie's hand during their very first meeting. Cameras caught the moment, fans reacted with shock, and whispers spread like wildfire. Why would the leader of the Catholic Church turn away from the actor who has moved millions with his role as Jesus in The Chosen? The truth, as you will see, is far more powerful than the moment itself. Before that moment of refusal stunned everyone watching, there was a story unfolding quietly, behind the scenes. To understand what really happened, you need to step into the world of both men, one carrying the weight of a spiritual throne, and the other carrying the burden of portraying the Son of God on screen. Pope Leo XIII had always been seen as a man of deep tradition. His presence in the Vatican was described as both gentle and unshakable, the kind of figure who made people feel both small and comforted at the same time. For years he had been admired as a shepherd of the Church, someone who believed in gestures filled with meaning rather than empty formalities. Every act, no matter how small, carried significance. For him, a handshake was not just skin touching skin. It was an exchange of honor, of equality, of recognition that went far beyond the surface. Jonathan Roumie, on the other hand, was not a pope, not a priest, not even an official religious leader. Yet millions of people worldwide had come to see him as something more than an actor. Through his role as Jesus in The Chosen, he had carried the emotions, the words, and the life of Christ into living rooms and churches across the globe. Audiences wept at his performance. They prayed harder because of his presence. They looked at him and, for just a moment, felt as though they were closer to God. For Roumie, this meeting with Pope Leo XIV was not just an honor. It was a crossing of worlds, a union of faith and art, of reality and portrayal. The Vatican halls that day glowed with the same ancient light that had seen kings, emperors, saints, and sinners pass through. High ceilings reached toward heaven. Stained glass filtered sunlight into colors that painted the marble floors, and silence carried its own weight. Every eye was on Roumie as he walked forward. He was dressed with respect, his face calm yet filled with quiet excitement. He knew the cameras were waiting. He knew millions would watch. And he knew this handshake, simple as it might seem, was going to be more than a handshake. It was history in the making. He stepped forward, his hand lifted, stretched out in greeting. The world seemed to hold its breath, and then, in a move that no one expected, Pope Leo XIV did not raise his own hand to meet it. Instead, he paused. He looked at Roumie with eyes that carried both depth and mystery. And in that pause, silence grew louder than words. People who saw the moment later would argue over it. Some said it was disrespect. Others thought it was a statement. But in that instant, Roumie himself felt confusion rise. Why would the Holy Father refuse such a simple act? The answer, unknown to the world just then, was waiting to be revealed in a way that would shift the meaning of the moment completely. When the Pope's hand did not rise, when the gesture of greeting seemed to be left hanging in the air, it was as if time itself had slowed down. The marble halls of the Vatican seemed to echo the silence louder than any choir. The world had waited for this meeting, and in that moment, everything felt uncertain. Cameras captured the still frame of Jonathan Roumie standing with his hand half extended, his expression shifting from hope to confusion. This was not the image anyone expected. For those standing nearby, the refusal struck like a sudden clap of thunder. Papal guards, aides, and a few members of the clergy exchanged quick glances. It was not the protocol they had rehearsed, not the greeting they had prepared to witness. Some whispered, others froze, but all of them understood that something unusual was happening. Jonathan Roumie's heart, steady when he had walked into the room, now beat faster. He was a man of faith, used to humility, and used to silence, but this was different. His hand lowered slowly, his face trying not to betray the unease he felt. He wondered if he had done something wrong, Was it his role as Christ on screen that caused hesitation? Was there a deeper reason the Holy Father chose not to meet his hand? Outside the Vatican, people would soon interpret this image in their own ways. Social media would seize on it instantly, cutting the moment into clips, turning it into headlines, fueling endless debates. But inside those ancient walls, the weight of the Pope's silence carried more than scandal. It carried purpose. Because Pope Leo XIV was not a man to embarrass, nor a man to humiliate. Every refusal, every pause, every gesture of his was calculated with meaning, a language all its own. For Roumie, standing in that sacred place, there was an almost invisible shift. Though the handshake had not come, though the cameras recorded what seemed like rejection, there was also something in the Pope's eyes. They did not look away. They did not show coldness. Instead, they lingered with intensity, as if saying more than 1,000 words. It was not absence. It was anticipation. The silence was not emptiness. It was a prelude. The world outside could not yet see it, but in that single pause, something was being prepared. It was as though the Pope was testing not only Roumie's patience, but also the understanding of everyone watching. Was faith truly about outward gestures, or was it about the hidden meaning behind them? Could people see beyond the surface, beyond the refusal, into the heart of what was really unfolding? That unanswered handshake did not end the meeting. In truth, it was only the beginning. The quiet that filled the hall was not the silence of rejection, but the silence before revelation. By the time Jonathan Roumie had left the Vatican halls, the image had already escaped into the world. Cameras had caught it from every angle, and within minutes the refusal was no longer just a private encounter. It was global news. The handshake that never happened turned into a symbol. On television screens, in newspapers, across every social platform, the still frame of Roumie's outstretched hand and the Pope's stillness was replayed again and again, each replay carrying a different tone, each interpretation heavier than the last. Some headlines called it a snub, others a scandal. For those who admired Roumie's work as Jesus in The Chosen, the moment felt like betrayal. Their beloved actor, who had brought faith to millions through his performance, had been denied the simplest gesture of respect. Voices online rose in outrage, accusing the Pope of arrogance. The clips went viral, shared with captions filled with disappointment, anger, and confusion. "Why refuse him?" one post read, echoing thousands of others. But there was another side too. Many came to the Pope's defense, insisting that the gesture carried hidden meaning. They spoke of tradition, of humility, of the deep symbols that often passed unnoticed by outsiders. To them, it was not rejection, but a teaching moment. "The Pope does not act without reason," one theologian wrote in a widely shared article. "The absence of a handshake may in fact be the presence of something greater." These voices were quieter at first, drowned beneath the storm, but they carried conviction. Meanwhile, Roumie himself remained silent. He did not rush to post, did not explain, did not defend. That silence, too, became fuel for speculation. Was he hurt? Was he angry? Or was he waiting, just like the Pope had waited in that quiet hall? The world did not know, and so the guessing grew. Churches discussed it during sermons. Talk shows argued over it. Fans divided, some praising Roumie for even daring to meet the Pope, others questioning why he was treated differently. The refusal, frozen in a single photograph, began to overshadow the truth. People clung to their own conclusions, rarely stopping, to ask what deeper meaning might be hidden in the gesture. But while the world shouted in fragments, both men, the Pope and the actor, were holding something unspoken, something that would only become clear in the moments that followed. The silence of the hall was still echoing, and though the crowds outside could not hear it, that silence was carrying a message far beyond what anyone expected. The cameras had captured only part of the story. What they missed was the moment that followed, a moment hidden from the quick snapshots that would later spread like wildfire. After the stillness, after that refusal which made the world gasp, Pope Leo XIV moved. His hands, which had remained at his side when Roumie first reached out, now lifted slowly. But instead of extending them for a handshake, he did something no one in the room had predicted. He stepped forward. There was no hesitation in his stride, no sign of dismissal or distance. His eyes, steady and unblinking, remained fixed on Jonathan Roumie. In an instant, the air shifted. The silence was not rejection, it was preparation. And then, as Roumie stood waiting, uncertain of what would come next, the Pope broke every expectation. He drew the actor into a full embrace. The Vatican hall, so heavy with formality, suddenly felt transformed. The murmurs of the priests and guards hushed. The embrace was not brief, nor was it casual. It was deep, deliberate, almost fatherly. Roumie's shoulders lowered, his confusion melting into understanding as he felt the weight of what was happening. This was not the dismissal the cameras had suggested. It was a recognition far greater than a handshake could have carried. To embrace is to remove barriers, to step beyond the politeness of protocol. The Pope was not treating Roumie as a visitor to be greeted quickly and sent on his way. He was treating him as family, as a brother in faith, as someone who carried a spiritual burden larger than any performance. The handshake had been withheld because the embrace was the true greeting. Those who witnessed it inside the hall later described the moment with awe. Some said they felt the atmosphere itself change, as though centuries of tradition had given way to a gesture of unity. Others described it as a teaching without words, a reminder that faith is not about appearances, but about depth, not about surface gestures, but about what lies beneath them. Roumie himself, though stunned, understood. His arms lifted and returned, the embrace. For a man who had spent years portraying Christ, this was not a moment of acting, but a moment of living faith. He realized the Pope's silence had not been to deny him. It had been to prepare him for something larger, a gesture that would remain etched in his heart long after the headlines faded. And in that sacred embrace, the mystery began to unfold. What the world had seen as refusal was in truth a lesson, a story told through silence and action. A reminder that sometimes the meaning of a moment is not in what is withheld, but in what is finally given. The outside world did not see the embrace at first. What they saw was only the refusal, and so they rushed to fill the silence with noise. Yet inside the Vatican, the story had already taken a different turn. For those who stood in that hall, the embrace lingered like a sacred echo. It was not simply a gesture between two men, it was a lesson played out before witnesses who would carry it into the wider world. Slowly, that lesson began to spread. When word of the embrace finally emerged, it carried a different weight than the still images of the paused handshake. Journalists who had only captured the first moment now scrambled to understand what came after. Those who had stood nearby described the Pope's movement, his choice to step forward and hold Roumie with warmth rather than formality. The story changed from a scandal to a revelation, and the shift in tone was unmistakable. Theologians began to speak. They explained that in Catholic tradition, gestures are never without meaning. A handshake can symbolize equality, a meeting of minds, but an embrace carries something deeper. It speaks of unity, of closeness, of family. By refusing the handshake, the Pope had not rejected Roumie. Instead, he had chosen to give him something greater, something that could not be mistaken for mere ceremony. The refusal was not the end. It was the doorway to a truer, more powerful welcome. As this understanding spread, the outrage began to soften. Some of those who had been quick to judge paused to reconsider. The viral clips that had painted the Pope as distant were now challenged by eyewitness accounts and fuller footage. People who had once written angry words online found themselves writing new ones, words of surprise, words of reflection, even words of apology. The moment that had looked like rejection was now being retold as an act of profound acceptance. Roumie's silence also became clearer in this light. His decision not to speak immediately, not to fuel the noise, was itself a kind of witness. He had allowed the truth to unfold in its own time, just as the Pope had. And when he did finally speak days later, his words confirmed the deeper meaning. He described the embrace as one of the most humbling and affirming experiences of his life. A moment where the line between his role as Jesus on screen and his own walk of faith seemed to dissolve. The truth was out now, and it moved people in ways no scandal ever could. What had begun as a storm of confusion was becoming a lesson carried into homes and hearts. The Pope had not humiliated Roumie. He had elevated him. And the embrace that followed was destined to be remembered as a symbol, not of division, but of the power of humility and deeper connection. Once the truth of the embrace reached beyond the Vatican walls, it did not stay confined to articles or headlines. It began to breathe inside people. Those who had once argued bitterly online found themselves watching the fuller story with new eyes, and the anger that had burned quickly now gave way to something quieter, something softer. It was as if the Pope's silent teaching had traveled beyond marble corridors and echoed into living rooms, churches, and schools across continents. In parishes, priests used the moment as a living sermon. They spoke about how faith often reveals itself not in grand speeches but in gestures that carry hidden meaning. They reminded their congregations that humility sometimes disguises itself as refusal, only to reveal itself later as a greater gift. The embrace between the Pope and Roumie became more than news. It became a parable. Parents told it to their children. Teachers shared it with students. Pastors wove it into homilies, and believers carried it into their daily conversations. Even outside the walls of faith, the story touched people. Non-believers, skeptics, and those who had grown distant from the church found themselves intrigued. Commentators on television admitted that there was something undeniably powerful about what had happened. It was not about celebrity, not about position, not even about ritual. It was about two men meeting in a way that stripped away titles and status and revealed something deeply human. The embrace became a reminder that people are not defined by outward recognition, but by the depth of connection they offer and receive. For Jonathan Roumie, the experience became a turning point. In interviews that followed, he spoke of how the Pope's choice taught him something profound. Portraying Christ on screen had given him a voice in people's spiritual lives, but in that moment with the Pope, he was reminded that his own journey of faith was not about performance, but about presence, not about acting, but about authenticity. The embrace was a call to live more deeply, to carry not just the role, but the reality of humility in his own life. And for the Pope, the moment strengthened. His reputation as a leader who communicates more with silence than with speeches, more with gestures than with proclamations. His refusal of the handshake and the choice of an embrace was now seen as a profound message to the modern world, a message that urged people to look beyond appearances, beyond surface-level judgments, and into the truth that often waits just beneath. From Rome to New York, from Manila to São Paulo, the story became more than gossip. It became a spark, a reminder that even in a world overflowing with quick opinions and shallow outrage, meaning still has power. And sometimes it takes a pause, a refusal, and then an embrace to reveal it. What began as a moment of shock became a message that could not be silenced. The image of Pope Leo XIV refusing Jonathan Roumie's handshake had been burned into the world's memory, but the embrace that followed became the true story that endured. Together, the two moments formed a lesson, one that reminds us that meaning is not always found in what we expect, but in what surprises us. The Pope could have accepted the handshake, and the meeting would have passed without controversy. Cameras would have recorded a polite exchange, people would have nodded, and the world would have moved on quickly. But by withholding the handshake and choosing instead to embrace Roumie, he gave a teaching that was stronger than any speech. He reminded us that faith is not about surface rituals alone, but about depth, about choosing something greater, even when the world expects something simple. For Jonathan Roumie, the meeting marked a chapter in his journey that no film role could ever script. He had lived years as the face of Jesus for audiences around the globe. But in that one embrace, he was reminded of his own humanity and of the humility required to carry such a calling. He learned that recognition is not always immediate and that sometimes the greatest honors come disguised as confusion before revealing their truth. For the millions who watched, the moment became a mirror. How many times do we judge quickly, react instantly, and miss the meaning hidden just beneath? How often do we treat silence as rejection, when it might instead be the space before a deeper connection? The meeting between the Pope and the actor became more than a headline. It became an invitation to slow down, to look deeper, and to recognize that what seems like denial may be a greater acceptance waiting to unfold. The world will remember the refusal, but those who look closer will remember the embrace. And in that embrace lies the heart of the story: humility, unity, and the power of going beyond the surface. That is what made the moment unforgettable. That is what turned scandal into parable. And that is what leaves us with a question each of us must answer in our own lives. When faced with the chance to offer a gesture, will we settle for the expected? Or will we choose something deeper, something greater, something that truly lasts? The cameras may have stopped rolling, the headlines may have faded, but the lesson remains. In the end, it was not the handshake that defined the meeting. It was the silence, the pause, and then the embrace that spoke louder than words ever could.